Good morning and welcome to the Football Show. If you're still keeping track, it's Tuesday, and with me today, Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville go through all the day's big talking points. But of course, there was big news out of the Premier League yesterday with a return to training for Premier League clubs in some form, at least. Patrick Davison joins us to go through all that. So what can we expect, Pat?
Well, like you said, Kelly, Premier League clubs and Premier League players can take their first tentative steps back into training today after the clubs voted unanimously yesterday to have a return of some sort, small groups, no contact. So I thought before we got into the nuance and the detail, let's go straight to the guys on that. Jamie, how big a step was it?
Yeah, I think it was a big step. I don't think anyone expected it not to go through. This is only just the start of it. I think there's three phases for the players in terms of going back to training. So the first one was always going to be the easiest one of no real contact groups of 4 or 5. I think it's when it becomes the full group and there is contact training maybe in the next few weeks. That's when there may be more questions certainly asked and looked at. But I didn't expect anything other than the decision that was given yesterday about training to restart. I think it's the first day of testing for players as well, and I'll be absolutely amazed if no one tests positive for COVID-19 up and down this country, and I fully expect that to happen. I think the results come out this afternoon if that's the case, really, and I think that is something that we shouldn't sort of get massively hysterical about. If it does happen, I think it will happen, and obviously that player would then have to obviously isolate, but that's bound to happen. It's happened in other countries, and it'll happen today at some sort in the Premier League.
So Gary, if we see that, the unity that we saw yesterday, unanimous vote, if we then get a positive result today for one of the players, someone tests positive, how big a test would that be of that togetherness we saw yesterday?
I don't think it'll be too big a problem if it's 1 or 2 players. I think that will be expected, and I agree with Jamie on that. What we shouldn't probably do is preempt, obviously, what happened, because if there was a situation where, I don't think it will, but let's say 4 or 5 players from one of the clubs fighting relegation were positive and had to go into quarantine for a period of time. Let's say West Ham had 4 or 5 players in their squad who were in their first team that were positive. You then would be put in, obviously, a position whereby they would be severely weakened. They wouldn't be able to get those players as fit as, obviously, the rest of the other teams in the relegation zone, and that's where the problems may start if something like that happened. But I don't anticipate it to happen. I think if one player from each club, 2 players, it's almost like having an injury. It's where if some reason there was a spread of it through one club that was fighting for relegation or having an impact on Champions League spaces, that's where I think the problems would lie. But I think it was a big day yesterday, in the sense that I think once you get players into a training ground and they're with their manager, with the coaching staff, they're running around. Obviously, they enjoy that. That's what players want to do. There doesn't seem to be too much of a pause point between stages to get back to the full time. So I would expect now, other than what I said before, which would be maybe a bout of 4 or 5, 6 players at one club getting it, and then all of a sudden that team being redundant from playing football, I would say that yesterday was a big moment, because I think it will mean that football will start again in a few weeks' time.
Okay, well, let me now just underline some of the developments yesterday from the announcement, the Q&A with Richard Masters and Richard Garlick that followed the vote. And you guys can just pick up wherever you like. So the league is to discuss quarantining players for 14 days before the first set of games kick off. The suggested kick-off date of June 12th was said to be only a staging post. Richard Masters said that. So it's a rough date, a flexible date that could be moved back if players and managers needed more time, and that has been mooted. Discussions over contact training and when that begins will start next week. The league's medical advisor, Dr. Mark Gillett, acknowledged an increased risk in BAME groups, but also said the risk is very small in young athletes. There will be unannounced inspections at training grounds to ensure safety and integrity are maintained. Spying, as the papers call it. And lastly, the league says it will support a trophy presentation for Liverpool if it is safe to do so. So, Jamie, I mean, go where you like with that, but the trophy presentation for Liverpool, reaction to that?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think Listen, I'm sure Jordan Henderson, whoever involved in Liverpool, would love to lift the trophy. I think we all accept Liverpool are going to win the title at some stage in the next 9 games, whatever that may be, and lifting the trophy again, as we always say, if it's safe to do so, and it's not a problem, of course, yeah. But I don't think Liverpool has really been the story in this. Certainly, probably in the last month to 6 weeks, it's more about the relegation and teams down there, and also you look at the things that you've just mentioned. The 2 things that stand out for me are quarantine and BAME players. And we've heard Troy Deeney come out, I don't know if it was yesterday or this morning, I've seen the reports about saying he won't go back to train. And you have to respect that. I think we've always said on this show, if a player doesn't feel safe or sound to go back, he can't go back. And if that's the case right across the league, then you'd have to hold off, because players' safety is more important than anyone. And this was always going to be the case, that maybe 1 or 2 players in every squad may not feel safe and may not want to go back. I don't think that would stop the Premier League going on. I think if players en masse said they didn't want to be involved, that'd be a big problem. But if there's 1 or 2 players in every club, I think that's something that the clubs or the Premier League are just going to have to accept and try and get them on board, certainly going forward. We know there is greater risk to BAME players, so that's something that I think Troy Deeney's right to pick up on it and try and get into more. Can there be more help for that situation in regard to the testing? In terms of the quarantine, I think certainly initially, if, as I suspect, a player will test positive for COVID-19, that's certainly not a case now, I think, where anyone needs to go into quarantine. They can self-quarantine now, but that's obviously something that's up for more discussion, I would believe, the further on you go through the phases in terms of training. But as I said a week or 2 ago, and I think Steve Parish a couple of weeks ago on this call said, Premier League training grounds and possibly stadiums and football clubs will be the safest workplace in this country to go back to. And I think you've always got to go back to that. I think the Premier League is doing as much as they can to make everyone as safe as possible. It's never going to be risk-free, because it won't be risk-free for the next maybe 6 to 12 months. But it is as safe as any working place. And I think if the Premier League put that to the players, I'm still convinced the majority of them will want to play and train.
Pat, can I ask you a question about the quarantine, please? In terms of what's the you say quarantine? They're going to be quarantined away from their families in sort of a hotel altogether. Is that what you're talking about? How's that quarantine going to work?
Hotel conditions, that's right, Gary. 14 days up to the kickoff of the first game. So in Germany, they did 7. The medical advice in this country from Public Health England is that 7 days not effective. So that would be 14 days up until the big kickoff, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I felt that the way in which the Premier League would be delivered would be through players being quarantined in a hotel, not just for the 14 days prior to the first match, but actually for a 2 to 3 week period. I was thinking they were going to shove the 9 games almost like a Saturday, Tuesday, Friday, Monday, Thursday, almost get them in as quickly as possible in a really condensed period where the players would be actually quarantined for the whole of that period, almost like a World Cup. It's not unusual for players in the Premier League to be away for 4 or 5 weeks, 2 weeks pre the game starting, then 3 weeks for the tournament. I'm not quite sure why it's going to be spread over 5 or 6 weeks, which what seems to be being mooted at the moment, and why they wouldn't remain in quarantine, because obviously it would be more safe. I think Troy Deeney this morning, I think a couple of other players have mentioned that they've got children with vulnerabilities, or whether they've got pregnant partners. Why would players not be quarantined for the period of the games? Why would it just be the 14 days pre the sort of game starting again?
Do you think players would be okay with that? Would that be accepted fairly readily, Gary?
Absolutely. I mean, I went to 8 tournaments as a player and coach with England and was away for 5 or 6 weeks. And to be fair, all those lads that are in that, all those lads that are there in the Premier League, the majority of them are international players and will have experienced that before, whether it be for 10 days for a double header, or whether it be 4 or 5 weeks where you're in a tournament. So, I mean, the reality of it is you do what's necessary to get things done. And the safest way of doing it, I think, would be to keep them in quarantine away from the families. The concern would be, I think, when the players finish that quarantine period, they've played the first game, then they go back home to the families. And we are talking about potentially this stretching into July, where the restaurants are going to potentially reopen again, shops and retail are going to reopen again. Now, you can say to players all you like, don't go to shops, don't go to restaurants, but their family members will be. You can't quarantine their family members who they'll be coming into contact with. So, yeah, I think that is a concern around restarting and potentially infection spreading amongst players who are exposed to obviously family members who are just going out into society again. And then the BAME question is one that sits a little bit uncomfortably with me in the sense that, if there is an increased risk to BAME players, and I don't think it's a time to be a trailblazer on this, there are still things that obviously the government are finding out about this disease, let alone obviously football. And the idea that players do obviously work under increased stress. Their systems are under increased stress just naturally when they're playing because they're working in the red zone physically quite a lot of the time. But also when you start talking about Champions League spaces up for grabs and relegation games, the stress and the immune system becomes challenged. And there does seem to be obviously a bigger impact on the BAME community. So I think that I can understand it if players we're nervous around those types of things. And I think there will be players dropping out and selecting not to play.
It's important to point out that there's still going to be a consultation on this quarantine. It's just something that they're working with and that they're still having discussions on because it's within government recommendations. But Jamie, as you said, if these rules are followed and if this testing is as widespread as we expect it to be, then this could be one of the safest workplaces in the country going forward. That's if all the regulations are kept to. So how important are the inspections, those unannounced inspections, going to be?
Well, they will be. And listen, what a lot of it boils down to is because there's a lot of suspicion up and down the Premier League, basically. And I think the finger's being pointed at the bottom six throughout this. No matter what comes up, the finger's being pointed at them for different things, maybe rightly or wrongly at different situations. And I think there's a feeling that maybe if someone is going to test positive, it'll be down the bottom six. I think that's probably a little bit out of order when we're talking about the seriousness of, what we're talking about the pandemic and testing positive for COVID-19. But it almost feels as if, I don't know whether that's come from the teams at the top. Make sure you check the teams at the bottom because there's been this thing, Gary mentioned it before, about 5 or 6 players, and he used West Ham as an example. I think we always feel like we use the bottom six as an example, really. And maybe it's unfair at different times, certainly in terms of the testing and positive tests that may come out at some stage today. But I think it's as much about actually training for 75 minutes. I read last night in terms of
that's right, Jamie.
Maybe fitter or stronger when they came back. So it's only 75 minutes training. So looks like there's going to be some stranger or on the side of the pitch, certainly with the watch and telling the boys when they finish. But I think it's going to be very difficult for him to get the players off after 75 minutes. I mean, your manager can't get you off the pitch after 75 minutes and someone will just stay out and take shots and free kicks and that. But obviously, players know the situation. They've got to come off the pitch. But I wouldn't envy that position, trying to get 25 lads off a training pitch.
Gary, I just wanted to bring you in on something that Jamie mentioned earlier, Troy Deeney's comments about potentially not returning to training. Is that not a huge issue, not just for Watford, but for the league in a wider sense? If a team that's threatened with relegation loses its captain and its talisman, you've got real questions there, haven't you, about the integrity of the league?
Yeah, but Patrick, we've just got to check ourselves there a little bit. I mean, I read this morning that Troy Deeney's got a 5-year-old child that's got vulnerable illnesses. Is Troy Deeney going to put that child at risk for a game of football? We have got to check ourselves here and sort of start to understand the individual nature of what each player will have to, after the decisions they have to make individually, what circumstances they're subjected to at home. So it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think I said this a few weeks ago. We had one player and one member of staff at Salford that we knew couldn't come back until there was further evidence that they were okay to do so because they had respiratory conditions. So there was no way that we were going to bring that player back in the initial phase. I know that Jamie referenced before about 6 to 12 months. This is going to be around for 6 to 12 months. But in 6 to 12 months, we'll know a lot more about this illness. There'll be a lot more evidence about how it impacts people. We're finding things out all the time. It was seen. I saw yesterday on the news that it was that loss of smell and taste is now a new coronavirus, an official coronavirus symptom. So they are still announcing things and finding things out about this illness. So I don't think it's a case for taking risks. And if you've got a player who's got asthma or other respiratory issues, then why would you take the risk on those players at this moment in time without evidence to suggest that they're going to be okay? And I think that's the same with Troy Deeney, who maybe will not want to expose his 5-year-old child to those problems. That's why I go back to quarantine. the choice could be given that, Troy and others may want to go in quarantine for 5 weeks. So that actually he doesn't expose his child, or he might say, no, I'm not comfortable doing that. But that's, again, an individual decision. And that's why I think, you can have a vote at Premier League level to unanimously return to training. But I do believe the consultation with players should come in conjunction with that decision. And I know there are clubs in the Premier League who've got 5 or 6 players in dressing rooms that don't want to return or are uncomfortable around certain things regarding stage 2 and 3 of this. And I think we have got some more issues and problems to resolve in the next few weeks. But let's see it play out. Having the vote without the players' sort of what would be full support, I think, is something that is a little preemptive, and we've got to wait to see what the players think. And like I said, there might be 4 or 5 players per club that say they're uncomfortable in returning. It might be that all players want to return. We don't know yet.
Yeah, so more consultations on phase 2 and contact training next week. Jamie, do you see that as being maybe the last remaining obstacle for the Premier League, agreeing to contact training?
Yeah, because that's obviously things that players are worried about, and that's the training is going to be stepped up. I think there was never ever going to be a problem in terms of coming back to training today for the players and how it was set up. I actually think some clubs, I know some of Liverpool's players have actually been using Melwood for the last week or so as well. So I don't think it's that much of a step up. I think officially it's the first phase, and it almost feels like day one back to training. I think it gives players or maybe managers and teams and supporters a little bit of a boost that the league will start on stage for the ones who want the league to start. But I certainly think, as Gary's mentioned, when it comes into contact training, 11v11 will have to be played. I think there will still be more questions to ask, but that is the next phase when the club captains get onto the conference call with the Premier League. But as Gary mentioned before, and I think with the Bundesliga start, I'm very confident now that Premier League will start. This is just the first start of it. Someone will test positive for COVID-19 today. There still will be more questions to get through in the different phases, but I think I'm a lot more confident now than maybe I was a month or 6 weeks ago that Premier League will start.